The small town sat quietly under the burning sun. Dust lifted from the ground every time a wagon rolled through the main street. Wooden buildings lined both sides of the road, most of them small shops or saloons. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed the moment they arrived. On that morning, a woman walked slowly into town. Her name was Ayanna, an Apache woman with dark braids that fell over her shoulders. She wore a simple dress, not fancy or colorful, just practical and plain. Her steps were steady and her face was calm, but she could already feel the weight of eyes staring at her. People on the street paused in their work. A man carrying barrels stopped mid-step. A woman sweeping her porch leaned on her broom, and a group of boys by the water trough began to whisper. Ayanna had been in this town before, but not often. Every time she came, she was reminded that she was different in their eyes. Yet she had her reasons for visiting. She needed fabric, and she had herbs to trade, herbs that could heal wounds and calm fevers. To her, these were valuable things. To others, they were curiosities at best. She walked with quiet dignity toward the general store. Her eyes did not shift from the doorway, even though she heard laughter behind her. Two men sitting outside the saloon chuckled and made jokes in voices loud enough for her to hear. She pretended not to notice. She had learned long ago that answering mockery only gave them more power. Instead, she moved forward, her basket in hand. When she stepped inside the store, the room went silent for a moment. The shopkeeper, a man with a large belly and thinning hair, looked up from behind the counter. He frowned as though he had seen something unpleasant. Ayanna gave a polite nod and placed her basket gently on the counter. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, carefully tied with string. "I would like fabric," she said softly, her voice calm. "I can trade these." The shopkeeper glanced at the herbs with a dismissive look. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "We don't have use for weeds," he said loudly. His voice carried across the room where two other customers stood, and they smirked at his words. Ayanna did not argue. She had heard this before. Instead, she waited patiently, as if giving him another chance. "Please," she said quietly, "these are not weeds. They are good for fevers, for cough, for pain." But the man only shook his head. "Not interested," he replied, pushing the basket slightly away with his hand. The other customers chuckled, and one of them whispered something that made the other laugh louder. Ayanna felt her chest tighten, but she did not let her face show it. She only nodded once, reached for her basket, and held it close again. The laughter grew as she turned toward the door. Outside, the sun felt harsher. Her steps were slow as she made her way toward the town's well. The sound of children laughing echoed near the street corner. She heard the teasing in their voices and knew they were speaking about her. One boy pointed as she passed, and the others joined in the mockery. Their words were sharp, meant to hurt, but Ayanna kept her eyes down. She had learned the strength of silence. At the well, she set her basket down and leaned to draw water. The rope creaked as she lowered the bucket. She could still hear laughter behind her. Two older boys shouted insults, calling her names they had heard from adults. The words stung, but Ayanna kept her back straight. She lifted the bucket of water with strong arms and filled her small clay jug. Her movements were steady, careful, almost graceful. On the other side of the street, a cowboy named Thomas was dismounting from his horse. He was tall, with a rugged look from years of riding the frontier. Beside him sat his little daughter, Lily, a child with bright eyes and golden hair. She slid down from the saddle and held onto her father's hand. Lily was only 6 years old, but she had the habit of noticing things others overlooked. Her curious gaze wandered across the street where she saw the Apache woman by the well. Lily tugged on her father's arm. "Who is that, Daddy?" she asked softly. Thomas looked over. He knew who Ayanna was. He had seen her before, though he had never spoken much to her. He also knew the way townsfolk treated her. He watched as she lifted the heavy bucket without complaint, even as the boys laughed. Something about her calm strength gave him pause. He did not answer his daughter right away. Lily, however, did not look away. Her small face showed no judgment, only curiosity. She remembered once when she had been thirsty, and a woman with long braids had given her water without asking for anything in return. She thought it might be the same woman. Meanwhile, Ayanna finished filling her jug and lifted her basket again. She turned slowly and began walking back down the road. The crowd at the saloon had grown louder, their voices carrying mocking laughter once more. She did not speed up, nor did she show fear. Her calm walk made some of them even more frustrated because they wanted her to react. Thomas's eyes followed her, while Lily's small hand held tightly onto his. The cowboy was silent, torn between the habits of the town and the quiet truth before his eyes. In his heart he respected strength, and he could see it in her. He also knew his daughter's innocence often revealed more wisdom than all the grown men around him. By the time Ayanna reached the edge of the square, whispers had spread. Women in bonnets leaned close to one another, speaking words too low for others to hear but casting glances that said enough. Men tipped their hats with mocking grins, not out of respect but as if mocking the idea of giving respect at all. Ayanna kept walking, holding her head high. She had survived harsher trials than the laughter of a town. She carried within her the memory of her people, her family, and the strength of her ancestors. That gave her the courage to face every insult without breaking. But Lily kept watching, her young heart sensing the unfairness that others ignored. She tugged again on her father's arm and whispered, "Why are they laughing?" Her question was simple, yet it carried a weight Thomas did not know how to answer. He looked down at his daughter, then back at the Apache woman. The sun was sinking lower and shadows stretched across the street. The day ended with laughter still echoing in the dusty air. But in the eyes of one little girl, the story of the Apache woman was only just beginning. She had seen something no one else had noticed, a quiet beauty, a strength in silence, and a dignity that could not be broken by cruel words. And though the town thought they had laughed her away, the child's memory held on to her with an innocence that would change everything soon. The sun rose again over the small town, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings. Life moved forward as usual. Wagons rolled in with supplies, men led their cattle past the main street, and women hurried to finish their daily chores. But for Ayanna, the Apache woman, the memory of the day before still lingered. She had walked through the town quietly, faced the laughter, and carried her dignity with silence. Though she had not spoken back to her mockers, the words had struck her heart like sharp stones. Still, she carried on because she knew strength was not in anger but in patience. She had not come to the town to win their approval. She had come because she needed fabric to mend her clothes, and she hoped to trade her herbs. But the refusal of the shopkeeper left her without what she needed. That morning, she thought again about whether it was worth returning. Yet something inside her told her to try once more. She tied her braids neatly, gathered her basket, and began the long walk toward the town. As she entered, people noticed again. A stranger was always noticed here, and she was not just a stranger, but one who stood apart from their kind. She passed the saloon where men were already gathered, their voices loud, laughter spilling into the street. One of them nudged another and whispered something, and soon the group erupted in chuckles. Ayanna's ears caught the sound, but her steps did not falter. She held her basket tightly and walked toward the marketplace. The marketplace was busier than the day before. Farmers had brought vegetables, traders had goods, and children ran between stalls. It should have been a place of exchange, of fairness, yet it felt heavy with unkind eyes. When Ayanna laid out her herbs again, hoping to offer them in trade, few even glanced her way. A woman picking apples laughed softly to her friend and said, "Who would buy from her?" Another man passed by and muttered under his breath, "She ought to go back where she came from." Still, Ayanna sat quietly, arranging her herbs with careful hands. She tied them in small bundles, each labeled in her own way. These herbs had healed fevers, eased coughs, and brought rest to those who suffered. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her how to gather them, how to prepare them with care, and how to use them to save lives. That memory gave her strength. She would not let the cruelty of strangers take away her purpose. As the morning passed, children began to circle near her stall. At first, they only stared. Then whispers began. A boy picked up a stone and tossed it lightly in his hand, pretending to aim before dropping it. The group laughed. Another boy mimicked her movements, mocking the way she tied her herbs. They thought they were clever, yet all Ayanna did was look at them once, her dark eyes steady. She did not scold them. She did not shout. She returned to her work with quiet hands. That silence unsettled them more than anger would have. They soon ran off, though their laughter trailed behind them. On the other side of the square, Thomas, the cowboy, was busy buying supplies. His little daughter Lily stood beside him, holding onto a small doll he had carved for her. She was not paying attention to the shopkeeper or the goods. Her eyes, as usual, wandered across the street. She saw Ayanna sitting alone with her basket of herbs. She saw the children who had laughed and the adults who ignored her. Something stirred in her small heart, a sense that it was not right. "Daddy," she tugged at his sleeve. "Why does no one talk to her?" Thomas glanced over. He saw the Apache woman again. He saw her patience, her calm strength in the face of mockery. He knew the answer his daughter was looking for, but it was not simple to explain. "People, they don't understand her," he said quietly. "But she looks kind," Lily replied. Her young eyes were sharper than most. She remembered the time weeks ago when she had tripped on a stone near the edge of town. A woman with braids had lifted her gently, dusted her off, and offered her a drink of water. She was almost certain it was the same woman. Lily's heart held on to that memory, even if the adults had forgotten it. The day wore on. Ayanna packed her herbs once more, unsold and untraded. As she walked past the saloon, a group of men called out in jest. "Hey there, you looking for gold?" One shouted. Another added, "Maybe she's searching for a husband." The men roared with laughter. Ayanna walked past without a word, her head high. Her silence only made their laughter sharper, as though they wanted to break it. From across the street, Thomas watched. He did not join the laughter. He held his daughter's hand and felt her small fingers squeeze tightly, as though asking him silently to do something. But Thomas stayed quiet, torn between the crowd's prejudice and his own sense of right. He was a man who had lived by strength, by the respect earned through hard work and honest hands. Deep inside, he knew there was no strength in mocking a woman who walked alone with quiet dignity. That evening, gossip spread quickly through the town. Women spoke on their porches, whispering about the Apache woman, mocking her appearance. Some said she was strange. Others said she had no place among them. Their words carried from house to house, weaving through the air like smoke. By nightfall, nearly everyone had heard something about her. But Lily, lying in bed, thought differently. She turned to her father as he tucked her in and asked again, "Daddy, why do they laugh at her?" Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, his face weary. He struggled to find words. "Sometimes people laugh at what they do not understand," he said at last. Lily frowned. She was too young to understand the weight of prejudice, but she was old enough to feel kindness. "She is not funny, Daddy," Lily whispered. "She is pretty." Her words were simple, but they carried truth. In her childlike way, she had seen past the dust, past the whispers, past the laughter. She had seen beauty in dignity, in kindness, in calm strength. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment. He felt something shift inside him. Perhaps children saw what adults had long forgotten: truth without judgment, beauty without bias. He leaned down, kissed her forehead, and left the room, his mind heavy with thought. Meanwhile, outside the window, the town was quiet. The moon shone down on empty streets. Ayanna sat alone at the edge of the forest, her basket beside her. She looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet prayer, remembering her ancestors. They too had faced hardship. They too had endured laughter and scorn, yet they had passed down wisdom and strength. She would not let cruelty take that away. The night was silent, but in the heart of a little girl named Lily, a seed had been planted. She saw what no one else dared to admit, and soon her innocent words would echo louder than the laughter of the entire town. The next morning came with the sound of horses' hooves on the dusty street and the chatter of townsfolk beginning another day. The saloon doors swung open and shut as men went in and out. The blacksmith hammered iron at his shop, sending sparks into the air. Women gathered near the market, their baskets filled with bread or vegetables. The town was alive with its usual rhythm, but under it all there was still a sense of curiosity and mockery surrounding the Apache woman. Ayanna walked once again into the town. Her steps were steady, her face calm, though she knew what awaited her. She had lived too long to believe that one day would change the hearts of many. Still, she came because she needed to try again, because survival was not about pride but about persistence. She carried her basket of herbs tied neatly in bundles and a few hand-carved items that might be of value for trade. As she reached the marketplace, the laughter began. It started with whispers, then grew louder. A man near the saloon nudged his friend and said, "Look who's back again. Think anyone will buy her weeds today?" Another man chuckled and added, "Maybe she thinks her charms will work this time." The crowd snickered, their voices sharp like thorns. Ayanna did not stop. She placed her basket on a small wooden crate, arranging her herbs with care. Each bundle had been chosen with purpose, each leaf collected with knowledge passed down through generations. She knew their value, even if no one here believed it. To her, these herbs carried the wisdom of her people. To them, they were nothing but strange plants. Not far away, Thomas entered the square with his daughter Lily riding beside him on the horse. The child's face lit up when she saw Ayanna again. She tugged at her father's sleeve excitedly. "Daddy, there she is," she said softly. Her voice carried the innocence of pure admiration. Thomas looked across the crowd, his eyes falling on the woman. He noticed the way people mocked her, the cruel smiles and whispered jokes. Something inside him tightened, though he remained silent for the moment. Lily slid down from the horse as Thomas dismounted. She stood on the ground, her small hands holding the reins loosely while her eyes stayed fixed on Ayanna. The girl's heart remembered the kindness she had once been shown. She remembered the way Ayanna had offered water when she had been thirsty, the way her eyes had held gentleness instead of scorn. To Lily, this woman was not strange or odd. She was graceful, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy clothes or painted faces. The crowd, however, thought differently. A few women nearby began to whisper loudly enough for others to hear. "What does she think she's doing here?" one said. "She doesn't belong," another replied. The sound of laughter rolled through the group like a wave. Ayanna kept her head bowed slightly, arranging her herbs as though she could not hear them. But she heard every word. She always did. Just then, one of the men near the saloon called out louder than the rest. "Hey, look at her! She thinks she's part of us now. Maybe she wants to marry one of our men." The crowd burst into laughter. The sound was harsh, echoing across the square. Ayanna's hands froze for a moment, her heart tightening, but she did not lift her eyes. She continued her quiet work, as though their cruelty could not touch her. Lily, standing beside her father, felt her small chest tighten with something she could not fully explain. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide, searching for an answer. He remained silent, though his jaw clenched. He had lived long enough to know that going against a whole crowd was not easy, but the way his daughter's eyes looked at him made him uneasy. The laughter grew louder as more townsfolk joined in. Ayanna straightened slowly, holding one of her bundles of herbs in her hands. Her eyes lifted just slightly and she looked out across the crowd. For a moment her gaze met Thomas's, then Lily's. The silence of her eyes held strength that words could not, and then, in that charged moment, Lily's clear voice broke through the noise. She tugged on her father's sleeve, pointed directly at Ayanna, and said loudly enough for all to hear, "Daddy, she is pretty." The words carried across the square like a bell ringing in a silent church. The laughter stopped at once. The men froze, their smirks fading. The women paused in their whispers. Even the children who had been giggling grew quiet. All eyes turned toward the little girl standing bravely beside her father. Her face was filled not with confusion but with pure honesty. The silence was heavy. Thomas felt every gaze shift from his daughter to himself. He looked down at her, then at Ayanna, who stood still, holding her herbs in her hands. Something shifted in his chest. He had always respected truth, and here was the clearest truth spoken by a child. Ayanna's lips parted slightly, her eyes softening as she looked at Lily. For a long time, she had faced laughter, insults, and silence, but no one had spoken such words to her in this place before. To be called pretty by a child who meant it with all her heart was more powerful than all the cruelty she had endured. The crowd stood awkwardly, their laughter replaced by unease. No one dared to mock further, for the innocence of the child had revealed the truth they had long denied. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away, ashamed though they would not admit it. The air felt different, heavier with the weight of what had just happened. Thomas finally stepped forward, placing his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. He looked at Ayanna, and for the first time he nodded respectfully. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it meant much. Ayanna inclined her head slightly in return, her eyes steady and calm. The crowd, uncertain and embarrassed, began to drift away. Their laughter no longer felt right. Their whispers carried less power. What remained in the square was the quiet truth of a little girl's voice, a voice that had spoken without fear or prejudice. Ayanna stood taller that day, not because she needed the approval of the town, but because a child had seen her as she truly was. That truth gave her strength. She gathered her herbs once more, her hands steady, her heart lighter. Lily beamed at her father, proud of what she had said. Thomas looked down at her with both love and thoughtfulness. He realized his daughter had spoken a truth he himself had been too hesitant to admit. In the clear eyes of his child, he saw beauty where others saw only difference. And in that moment, he understood that perhaps she was teaching him, just as she was teaching the town. The day moved on, but the memory of those words would linger. The laughter that had once filled the square was now replaced with silence, reflection, and the quiet stirring of change. And for the first time, the Apache woman walked away from the market with the dignity of being seen for who she was. The square was never the same after that morning. A child's words had broken through the noise of gossip and laughter. "She is pretty, Daddy." The simple sentence had echoed in every ear, carrying truth so pure that no one could dismiss it. Though no one spoke of it openly, the townsfolk felt a shift inside themselves. Their laughter had turned into silence, their whispers into unease. For the first time, they saw the Apache woman not as an object of scorn, but as someone human, someone who carried herself with grace even when mocked. Ayanna walked through the streets that day with her basket held firmly in her hands. The difference was not in her but in those around her. Men no longer dared to shout jokes as boldly as before. Women no longer sneered as openly. Their eyes still watched, but their expressions carried hesitation. Children who once mocked her with stones and laughter now stood quietly, remembering the small girl's words that had silenced an entire crowd. Thomas walked beside his daughter Lily, holding her hand. He thought of what she had said and how it had struck not only the crowd but himself. He had always taught Lily to speak kindly, to treat others with fairness, but he had not expected her to teach him a lesson in return. That morning he realized his little girl had a strength beyond her years. She had spoken truth in the face of mockery without fear, and it had changed everything. As the day went on, Ayanna returned to her small home near the edge of the forest. She laid out her herbs, the bundles still neat and fresh. She looked at them with pride, for they carried not only the knowledge of her people, but also the dignity she held on to. She whispered to herself, remembering her grandmother's words. Strength is not in the shout, but in the silence that cannot be broken. Her grandmother had faced much worse than laughter. Yet she had stood tall, passing down wisdom to the next generation. That memory gave Ayanna peace. The next few days brought quiet change. A man who had once laughed at her came to her with a fever. His wife, unsure but desperate, asked if she had anything to help. Ayanna did not refuse. She gave them a bundle of herbs with simple instructions. By the next day, the man's fever broke. Whispers spread quickly. The Apache woman's herbs worked. She was not foolish, not strange. She carried knowledge that none of them had. Soon others came quietly, not wanting to be seen at first. A mother with a sick child, a farmer with an aching back, a woman who could not sleep at night. Ayanna treated them all with patience. She asked for nothing in return, but was often given food, fabric, or coins as thanks. The townsfolk, once quick to laugh, began to soften. They remembered the words of the cowboy's daughter and now saw them proven true. The Apache woman was not only pretty in the eyes of a child, but also wise, strong, and kind. One afternoon, as Ayanna returned from gathering herbs, she found Lily waiting near the well with her father. The little girl smiled brightly and ran to her. "I waited for you," Lily said, holding out a small flower she had picked. Ayanna's heart warmed as she accepted the gift, tucking it gently into her braid. Thomas, standing nearby, gave a respectful nod. He had once stayed silent when others mocked, but now he felt ashamed of that silence. It had taken his daughter's innocent truth to remind him that respect was not weakness, it was strength. The townsfolk watched these moments closely. They saw how Lily admired Ayanna, how Thomas offered her the respect others had long denied. Whispers spread again, but this time not with mockery. "The cowboy's daughter likes her," someone said. "She helped my boy's fever," another admitted. Slowly, the wall of prejudice began to crack. It was not destroyed in a single moment, but each act of kindness, each word of truth, weakened it further. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of red and gold, Ayanna walked through the square again. This time the saloon doors opened, and instead of cruel laughter, a man simply nodded at her. A woman at the market offered her a smile, hesitant but real. Children no longer threw stones. Some even approached, curious about the herb she carried. Ayanna showed them gently, explaining what each plant could do. They listened wide-eyed, realizing she carried knowledge far greater than they had ever imagined. Thomas stood nearby, watching as the same woman who had once been the center of laughter now became the center of quiet respect. He knew the town had not fully changed. Prejudice did not vanish overnight, but something had begun. And it all started with Lily's words. He looked down at his daughter, who was now laughing with Ayanna as they sorted herbs together. He felt a sense of pride that his little girl had spoken so bravely. The night grew quiet, but in the hearts of many, thoughts lingered. Some wondered how they could have been so blind, so quick to laugh at what they did not understand. Others still held on to their old ways, but even they could not forget the child's voice. When they tried to laugh again, the memory of those words stopped them. "She is pretty, Daddy." It was a phrase too pure to dismiss, too honest to deny. Days turned into weeks, and the Apache woman slowly became a part of the town's daily life. She was still different, still marked by her heritage, but the cruelty lessened. Respect grew in its place, fragile yet real. And every time Lily saw her, she ran to her side with the same joy as before. Ayanna, once alone in her silence, now found comfort in the unexpected friendship of a cowboy's daughter. She realized that sometimes change did not come through force or argument, but through innocence and truth spoken by the purest of voices. And though she had been laughed at, mocked, and dismissed, she now carried with her the memory of that single moment when the world shifted. It was not the loud voices of men or the harsh whispers of women that shaped the town's heart. It was the voice of a little girl filled with honesty, kindness, and love. That voice had reached where no one else's could, and in that truth, Ayanna found hope. The seasons began to change slowly, as they always did in the small frontier town. The air grew cooler, the leaves turned golden, and the long days of summer softened into shorter days of autumn. Life in the town continued, but something within its heart had shifted since the morning Lily had spoken those unforgettable words. People did not forget easily, and even those who had once laughed now carried the weight of silence when they thought of that moment. Ayanna walked through the streets with a new kind of presence. She was still quiet, still graceful, but she no longer carried only the burden of mockery. Now she also carried the memory of respect, the respect she had been given by a child and slowly, cautiously by others. It did not erase all the years of laughter, but it gave her strength to walk without fear. Families who had once whispered cruel things now came to her in need. A child with a rash, a man with a wound that would not heal, an old woman who could not sleep at night. Each came to Ayanna with hope instead of mockery, and she without hesitation gave them what she could. She brewed teas, made poultices, and offered simple instructions. She asked for little in return, sometimes nothing at all. Her heart was not bitter, it was generous. Those who once looked down on her began to see that generosity, and it softened even the hardest faces. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Thomas rode into town with Lily at his side. The girl was growing taller, her hair tied neatly with a ribbon. She had become known to all as the cowboy's daughter who had silenced a crowd with nothing more than truth. She did not know the weight of her words then, but the adults remembered, and so did Ayanna. When Lily saw Ayanna near the well, she rushed to her with the same joy as always. The townsfolk watched as the girl hugged the Apache woman warmly, without hesitation or shame. To Lily, there was no difference between herself and Ayanna. She only saw kindness, beauty, and strength. That bond between the two grew deeper with every meeting, and the town could not ignore it. Thomas, standing nearby, often reflected on how his daughter had changed not just the woman's life, but his own. He had once stayed silent, letting the crowd's cruelty pass without his voice. Now he realized silence could wound as deeply as words. He had learned that speaking truth, even when simple, could carry the power of a storm. And so he treated Ayanna with open respect. He greeted her openly, tipped his hat with sincerity, and even traded goods with her without hesitation. Others saw this and began to follow his example. Over time, Ayanna was no longer seen as a shadow moving through the streets. She became someone people sought out, someone whose presence they accepted, even valued. She was still different, still marked by her heritage, but no longer laughed at as before. The cruel voices had been replaced by cautious respect, then by genuine trust. The wall that had once kept her apart from them was not fully gone, but it was crumbling. One evening, the townsfolk gathered for a small harvest celebration. Lanterns hung outside the saloon, tables were set with food, and music drifted into the night air. Children laughed and played while men and women shared stories. For the first time, Ayana walked among them without fear of laughter. She carried a basket of bread she had baked, a gift to share. There were still eyes that watched her with hesitation, but others smiled, nodding in greeting. Lily ran to her side and held her hand proudly. "Come sit with us," she said, pulling her toward the table where Thomas waited. The cowboy gave a warm nod, making space for her. The sight was not lost on the crowd. They saw the bond that had formed, a bond stronger than the prejudice that once ruled their hearts. As the night went on, Ayana shared her bread, and the people tasted it with surprise at its sweetness. They asked her quietly about her herbs, her ways, her knowledge of the land. She answered with patience, her voice calm and steady. The fear of the unknown slowly gave way to understanding. From that night forward, her place in the town was no longer on the outside. She became part of its fabric, woven carefully but firmly into its life. Her strength, her silence, and her kindness had won what anger never could. Lily's words had been the spark, but it was Ayana's dignity that carried the flame forward. Years later, when Lily was older, she still remembered the moment she had spoken those simple words. "She is pretty, Daddy." At the time, she had not understood why it mattered so much. She had only spoken what her heart saw. But as she grew, she came to realize how powerful that moment had been. A child's honesty had broken through walls that generations had built. Thomas, too, remembered. He would often tell others, "It wasn't me who spoke that day, it was my little girl, and she taught us all something we had forgotten." His voice carried pride, but also humility, for he knew he had once stayed silent when he should have spoken, and Ayana, who had endured the laughter of many, carried with her the gift of that truth for the rest of her life. She knew that sometimes the greatest change did not come from warriors or leaders, but from the innocent voice of a child. She never forgot the kindness in Lily's eyes, the way she had seen beauty when no one else dared to look. The story of that moment spread beyond the town. Travelers who heard it carried it to other places, telling how an Apache woman had once been laughed at until a child's voice revealed the truth. It became a quiet legend of sorts, a reminder that dignity and kindness could outlast cruelty, and that the eyes of a child often see what adults choose to ignore. In the end, Ayana was remembered not for the laughter she endured, but for the respect she earned. And Lily was remembered for the words that began it all. The town itself was remembered too, not for its cruelty, but for its change. Because one day in a dusty square under the bright sun, a little girl had spoken truth without fear, and the world around her had shifted forever. The laughter of the past faded into memory, but the echo of Lily's voice remained strong. Ayana walked with dignity, Thomas walked with pride in his daughter, and Lily grew up knowing she had spoken words that carried more power than any shout, any insult, or any cruel whisper. "She is pretty, Daddy," and so it was, truth spoken, hearts changed, and a legacy of respect that endured long after the dust of that little town had settled.